Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim, here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. One, because we get to introduce to our listeners for the first time an amazing researcher who's worked with us over the past few months and delivered to us research that is thorough, accurate, and put together in a way where you feel like you're really hearing a story about somebody. So it comes from this very empathetic place. But there's a place I want to know where you're coming from, and that is your mood. Where is this at?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking, Lance. I'm also excited to introduce Maryann Stone White to our audience. She has been researching for us a little bit and has been doing some great work. And she has a great background to discuss the psychology of a killer couple like Patricia and Allen Prue. And of course, on Thursday's release of Missing, we spoke about the murder of Melissa Jenkins, who was a 33-year-old schoolteacher from St. Johnsbury, Vermont, when she was lured out of her abode and murdered by Patricia and Allen Prue in March of 2012. And it's just such an incredibly tragic case, and the psychology of how this could happen was just so fascinating to us that we really wanted to speak with Maryann about it.
And Maryann really knows her stuff. She is educated in philosophy and, most importantly and applicable here, criminology and criminal justice. So, Tim, if people are hearing this on the subscription feed, it's early and it's ad-free. But what about those who are not subscribed?
Well, you could have been hearing this early and ad-free on Missing Premium if you go to missing.supportingcast.fm, or you can now even subscribe to Missing Premium on Apple Podcasts. It's just $4.99 a month. You get all of our episodes ad-free and some of them early, like this one was. And you'll also get our weekly bonus show where we talk about life behind the scenes here at Crawlspace Media, but we also dig in deeper to the cases that we cover, and maybe we share some more of our opinions, Lance, and sometimes those opinions are fiery.
And I gotta say, I think we're gonna be doing more than one of those subscription shows with Melissa Jenkins' murder and Patricia and Allen Prue as a topic, because there's a whole lot to unpack and really get fired up about and try to get that out of our system.
And if you do subscribe to Missing Premium, you'll see that after our episode about the Prues that aired last week, we also spoke a little bit more in depth about some killer couples, some other killer couples that, are terrifying, really, but also just kind of psychologically interesting as well.
That's a great point. And I think that that's an additional layer to this whole conversation, and actually to the entire body of work that we've been embarking upon all of these years, because there are always similarities. And this one is such a perceived outlier from the start. And then once you look into it a little bit deeper, you see that it's not really an outlier to have two people forming a couple that commits murder. So yes, as we started to unpack this one, we started to see the layers, and naturally we were like, well, what are some of the similarities with other couples that commit crimes and kill together?
Okay, so I hope you enjoy Missing Premium, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Maryann Stone White as well. As always, you can follow us on social media at MissingCSM, and we're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Maryann.
And if you're listening on Thursday as a subscriber, happy holidays. You get no commercials.
Welcome to the podcast, Maryann White. How are you today, Maryann?
I'm doing great. How are y'all doing?
Doing fantastic, and really happy that the listeners get to hear your voice. If you're watching on YouTube, they get to see your face as well, because we talk about you all the time. You deliver to us all of this research for the missing people that we cover, as well as the solved cases that we've started to look into as well and tell the stories of. And you do such a great job, and we're so lucky to have you. And now I'm so excited to have the listeners know that you do exist.
I do. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and be on the show. Used to doing the kind of some of the behind the scenes stuff, but I'm excited to be able to talk about it with y'all today.
Us as well. But before we talk about this particular tragic case, can you talk a little bit about how you became involved with this show and how the research started for you?
Also your background too, please. Yeah.
So I am currently an associate professor of criminal justice and criminology. And I do a lot of my academic research on violent offenders and the psychological aspects of criminal behavior. I've kind of always been interested in criminal behavior and, human behavior and why people do the things that they do. And I've always been kind of a problem solver and really detail oriented. So I think that's one of the reasons why my focus tends to be on some of these, serial killer cases and missing persons cases, because they're kind of really hard to understand and comprehend how someone or how these people can become involved in these types of crimes and behaviors. So I continue to try to better understand these people and why they commit these types of crime. Same with missing persons. It's hard to understand what happened, and really trying to determine in specific cases what that missing piece is to hopefully find that person. So I am really into true crime and watching all of those true crime documentaries and TV shows, and it's kind of late to the podcast game, but I've gotten into that a little bit more, and in listening to Missing Maura Murray and some other podcasts, I just decided to reach out to you guys one day and, say, hey, do you need any help with this research? Do you, would you ever want anybody to help with looking into some of these cases? And I was lucky enough that you all responded pretty quickly, and we were able to get things going so that I could start doing some of this research for you.
Everything you said was accurate, except for you were late to the podcast game. I think your timing was perfect, because if you'd come in any earlier, someone else would have taken you as their researcher and we would have missed out. So timing was perfect there.
I appreciate that.
No, we appreciate it.
And tell us about, I guess, what mysteries do you like the best? Like, you've actually brought some of these cases, some of the research that you've done, you've brought them to us, if I'm not mistaken, with Amber Tuccaro and possibly Cullen Finnerty as well. Melissa Jenkins's case is one that we asked you to look into for us. But what is it about the cases that you choose? Like, where is that interest for you?
I'm not sure that it's necessarily just one thing that stands out to me. But when it's, a case where it's a little unusual or, a different kind of victim than we're used to, or something that was maybe either unsolved or more difficult to solve and maybe took some more time to ultimately determine what really happened. I like trying to dig up as many details of these cases as I can to kind of get the full story. I think that listeners oftentimes want to kind of be able to understand what happened from beginning to end, as well as, some background information. So I try to just find cases where I can get as much information as possible to tell the story of those victims.
And they're so detailed, and you present them to us in a almost narrative fashion where you're telling the story. And we really appreciate that style, because it's really conducive to the way we want to get that story out there and talk about it. So I'm curious where you even start. How do you separate, and maybe you kind of answered it in that last answer, but how do you separate this being a story narrative and plugging in details? Like, how do you? Okay, you're nodding, so you understand what I'm asking, even though I'm not articulating it.
I think so. So I kind of just start with a general Google search to see kind of what comes up on the cases using different keywords. I'll put in victims' names, offender names or suspect names. If the case had a certain nickname or something. So I'll look, just do kind of a general search in the beginning, see what I can find, what's out there, like I said, under different keywords. And I usually take pretty detailed notes as I'm doing that and going through. And oftentimes one source will lead me to some other sources. So I use that kind of to, in some cases, snowball the sources or information to get as many details as possible. And I take notes and I write all of the facts and everything down. And then after that, I think is when I try to put it into more of a narrative to kind of tell that story in a way that holds attention and, keeps people listening and wanting to know, what happened next and how this story ended.
Well, it's well done. So we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for all your hard work. And most recently, you helped us with some research for the case of the murder of Melissa Jenkins. And there are 2 people who are incarcerated for this horrendous murder of a school teacher from Vermont. She was 33 years old at the time. What were your first thoughts when you started looking into this case?
This case was interesting. I liked that it was different in having the duo or the team killers, as they're sometimes called, and really looking into how they worked as a team, what the kind of dynamic was there, and and then also looking into the victimology and how they, kind of chose their victim or decided on who their target was going to be.
What was it about the fact that they were a married couple and decided to do something like this that stood out to you? Did anything click to you in your experience as, working in the criminal psychology industry?
I think it's interesting that like you said, they both seem to have this kind of dark side to them. And, it makes me wonder whether they both have always had that, or if, one of them brought that out in the other one. Sometimes we tend to see sort of a dominant person in the duo and then a more submissive person. And I think that might have been the case here a little bit, and actually opposite of what we might expect it to be. A lot of times we hear dominant and submissive, and we tend to assume that the male is always the dominant character. But in this case, it seems like the female was perhaps the more dominant one. Some of the research showed that she was said to be a bisexual, and so she was the one that wanted to bring additional people into, their relationship, and that he was kind of apprehensive at first, but she had kind of always had that control over him and was able to, either get him to comply or agree to it, or, just kind of let it happen. So it's interesting looking at the dynamic of the people working together versus a lot of times in murders, and specifically serial murders, the suspect is working alone. And so to look at the dynamic between the individuals can be really interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like what you said about a sort of reluctant accomplice. I was going to ask if you thought one of them was reluctant. In the research that we've done on some other killers, killer couples like Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, like they almost always turn on each other, and it does almost seem like there's always one reluctant accomplice. But in the Prue's case, it was a little harder to tell who that was, if that was anybody, because they also turned on each other, when they were arrested. But I agree with what you're saying. I think if there was anyone who was more dominant here, I think it was Patricia. Also, Allen brought her to where he lived, which is kind of an interesting element. I wonder if Patricia or Allen attempted something like this before, maybe attempted to find someone who would be interested in these kind of things previously to meeting themselves.
Yeah, I wonder about that too. But it's also interesting that he is said to have attacked her immediately when she got out of the car. So, that puts a little bit of the dominant aspect back onto him. So maybe it's more so that they perhaps feed off of each other. And I wonder if, like you said, either was involved before, or if it just took having them both working together or coming up with these plans together to ultimately move forward, perhaps beyond fantasy into actual, acting it out in reality.
In your opinion, how much conversation do you think they had when they were talking about doing something like this?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I know that he had said she randomly called her and said that they were having car trouble. But I think and he also had said that they planned to, I think he was quoted as saying, get a girl that day, but that their initial intention wasn't to do so forcefully. But I find that kind of hard to believe, by the way that they lured Melissa Jenkins to the location where the crime occurred. The fact that I don't think they had contact with her in quite a while. So to specifically call her to come meet them, to help them with their car trouble was interesting, and seems like it, must have been part of their plan. So I think it was more planned out than they will admit to or lead on to.
And it seems pretty clear that they were intending for violence that night, even though they may have said different before. And maybe it's true before that happened that they weren't planning on it. But by the time they got there, they were clearly planning on it. And, they, as you noted, they attacked her right away. Mm-hmm. With both of them actually being a part of that violence as well.
That's another thing that's interesting, going back to that, having a dominant part of the duo. Most of the time when there is a more dominant character, they are usually the ones to engage in most or all of the violence and the actual murder. And this case, like you said, was different, where he attacked her right away, and then afterwards Patricia Prue went on to strangle her and ensure that she was dead. So they both seem to be a big part of that.
Yeah, I think that this was obviously planned out as a kidnapping, and whether they were going to keep her for a while or, and use her in a sexual manner for an extended period of time, I'm not sure of. But the fact that they would engage in sexual activity with another person, so the two of them would bring in a third, and they got that person through online dating apps. So that's how they did that. So this is completely outside of that MO if they just simply wanted to get a girl in a sexual way.
Right.
This was totally planned that they were going to kidnap her. Maybe the murder wasn't planned, but when you read about how Melissa was strangled by both of them and beaten, I mean, you don't beat somebody, two people don't beat somebody to that extent without completing the job as an accident.
Right, I agree. And like you said, potentially the original plan was the kidnapping, but with the different way they went about selecting her versus previous partners, this definitely showed something different was intended.
Well, this was a woman that Allen Prue had been attracted to in the past, and Patricia likely knew that. I have to wonder if that was part of why they chose her.
I think it definitely played a role in it. A lot of times with serial killers, we find a fantasy aspect where it, seems to, in some cases, originate from or progress from having, the fantasy of, a certain type of victim or doing certain things to a victim. And ultimately that fantasy is no longer satisfactory. And so they eventually end up acting out that fantasy. And I wonder if that was kind of the case with this case, in that he had worked for her, had asked her out on a date a few times and, was rejected. And if, he had long fantasized over her and ultimately, he wanted to make that fantasy a reality. And perhaps Patricia had different intentions. And so maybe that's why it ended up moving the way that it did. But I definitely think him having that past attraction played a role in the selection of the victim here.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And what do you make with the business card? Allen Prue's business card was found in Melissa Jenkins's car, and Melissa, before she went to assist the Prues that evening, made a phone call to her ex-boyfriend to tell him where she was going. And again, we don't know if she brought the business card, Allen Prue's snowplow business card, in her car, or if it had been there since they met a couple years before. But the fact was that helped police connect the Prues with Melissa's disappearance. And then the police also found out that the Prues had gotten a burner phone. So yeah, this is definitely a premeditated crime. There's no doubt about that. What do you make about what Melissa did before she went to see the Prues?
Yeah, that was really smart of her to contact somebody and let them know where she was going, who she was going to meet. And then it's hard to determine whether that business card just happened to be in her car, maybe among other business cards, but through telling the ex-boyfriend who she was going to meet, they were, able to find that and pinpoint exactly who it was. But it may be more likely that she brought along that business card, not necessarily because she suspected something might happen to her, which she may have, but she may have simply brought it because it had phone numbers or addresses or other information about these individuals that, she was supposedly going to help because their car had broken down. Ultimately, it turned out to be an excellent piece of evidence. And, obviously the Prues were not counting on her talking with anyone else or letting anybody else know where she was going. But that was kind of, ultimately their downfall and what led to their arrest, because they didn't pretend to be somebody else. They didn't lure her out using an alias, or they didn't surprise her in her home. The fact that they used their real names to lure her to that location, ultimately is, again, what got them caught. When she didn't return and the ex-boyfriend wasn't able to make contact with her, he knew where she was supposed to be and who she was supposed to be meeting with. So made it pretty straightforward for detectives or officers to figure out, who may be involved.
It's a pretty obvious scenario that doesn't leave a lot of room for gray area as far as who perpetrated this murder, Melissa's murder. But Allen has maintained his innocence. Even today, right? He's in jail, and he's still saying that he didn't have anything to do with the murder of her, and he was only really guilty of bringing this other person into the state, meaning Patricia. And Allen's mother found this comment that she made really interesting. She described him as a good boy, and I'm just going to read this comment. "I do not believe he would ever do this because he didn't have it in him." I think that's really interesting. She didn't say that. I just said that. She goes on to say, "I have nothing against her," meaning Patricia. "I have nothing bad to say about either one." So it's really interesting to me that she says, because he didn't have it in him. And it made me think that he was in a relationship with his mother that was really domineering as well, that his mother maybe showed, or Patricia showed signs of his mother. And that was something that he just couldn't get out of a life cycle of. When you see the female part of a relationship being emotionally and physically abused, it's pretty common to see that the father of the female side of that relationship was also emotionally abusive, either to that person's mother or to that person. So I feel like it was similar, that they had this similar dynamic as him and Patricia. Did you feel the same way?
I did. I agree with that. It seems to have that same kind of cycle of behavior through generations. And I think it also goes to show that you don't always know people. And, how many times do we hear of these cases where, hindsight's 2020, but even then, sometimes people are like, no, it could not have been that person. They were a family man or a hard worker or whatever the case may be. Plenty of some of these horrible individuals are married or have children and, work everyday jobs where they're never suspected of committing some of these gruesome crimes, and they're able to hide it from others. So that could definitely be the case, or more so, like you said, having that kind of domineering aspect that went from his mother treating him in that way to Patricia treating him in that way, and him just basically kind of doing what he's told or going along with, what the woman wants to do.
Do you think that it's possible that he might have been abused emotionally, physically, or sexually by his mother?
I definitely think it's possible. Sure. Of course, we don't have any information on that. So it's hard to say for sure, but at least some potential for that emotional abuse that, puts him more in that submissive position.
Yeah, I feel like there's just something that's there that I can't put my thumb on. Like, I can't wrap my head around, I can't identify it, because him being apprehensive about them bringing a third person into the relationship, she was bisexual. Like, there's nothing unhealthy about that. If you take out the fact that they went and murdered somebody, they murdered Melissa later on. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
There's something that's there. His apprehension, they're like that escalating to kidnapping and murder. So where does that come from?
But his mom is so wrong too in this quote. Like she's
Well,
so
totally, yeah.
so wrong.
And I think he still lived with her at the time.
What?
Yeah, I believe he still lived with his mom at the time he was in this relationship with Patricia, and they're both were in their early 30s.
Well, the mom thinks that he didn't have it in him to do, and Patricia also didn't, but Melissa's dead and they both did it. So the mom is so wrong about it all. I mean, I wonder if what she's really saying is like, I can't figure out in my own head how this happened. He didn't have it in him. That's like her saying, I can't believe this, but it clearly happened, and it was clearly them.
Yeah, her statement, the mother's statement afterwards, is a bit odd. You would think that, the mother of somebody who's being accused of carrying out this crime would be, pretty up in arms about it and adamant of their innocence, and, would say more than just he didn't have it in him. Because like you said, apparently he did. So what happened there?
Yeah, she doesn't even follow Allen's lead and say it was Patricia. She just says it was neither of them.
Right.
And maybe just not being able to relate with somebody who's in that position, who knows what goes through someone's mind, and she could have just said something off the cuff, and it's, now there's years later we're talking about it and dissecting it, but there's something. I mean, they killed this woman. They killed this poor woman. So there's something that went wrong. Something broke in both of them somewhere, and we're trying to figure that out because we talk about missing people all the time, and somebody made them missing. So something broke in all of the cases that we talk about, all the stories that we cover.
And their defenses are both bad, I think, because neither of them really went all the way with I was the reluctant one here. Patricia apparently attempted an insanity defense before she had her lawyers argue PTSD. Allen tried to blame Patricia, but really couldn't go that far because even the judge said, well, his strength actually was a vital part in how Melissa was killed. So I feel like they had terrible defenses also, and it leads me to think that it's just both of them. It's not really, it wasn't one of them. Like, they're both lacking the intelligence to get away with what they were trying to do with their defense.
Right. When we see more than one offender, a lot of times we see them turn on each other, but in a way where whoever does it first is doing so to lessen their charges or their punishment. And that didn't really happen here, which is kind of surprising, but I don't know.
And what do you make of Patricia calling out Allen and saying that she's sorry that he's not able to come to terms with what he did, and he didn't have it in him to come to terms like she did with what they did?
Yeah, I think that might go back to her kind of dominant personality, where she's again kind of sticking it to him, saying, hey, I'm here, I'm admitting to my part in this, I'm taking my punishment as it was given. Why are you still denying being a part of this and not, kind of manning up to your actions?
It's such a weird quote for her to say during her sentencing. I want to apologize personally for the fact that my husband wasn't a strong enough human being to admit his wrongs and be able to take his rightful punishment willingly. I mean, that's almost saying what they did was okay as long as you take your punishment, right? What a weird thing to say. What a weird couple anyway. I guess why would I be surprised? Like, really, what was she going to say up there that I would ever read and be like, oh, that makes a lot of sense?
She had gone one way or another and actually sounded apologetic. I think that's something that happens occasionally, or you just wouldn't speak if you don't feel that remorse. She didn't have to.
And she was once again throwing it onto him and not taking responsibility herself. She could have gotten up there and, like you said, apologized and, talked about how she felt remorse and she was sorry for what they did, but it wasn't about her. It was about him and what he was doing wrong. And I think that goes back to the possible emotional abuse that he may have endured from potentially his mother and his wife.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Yeah, I just want to play a quick thought experiment here. Now, what do you think would have or could have happened had Melissa not brought that business card or placed that phone call to her ex-boyfriend? And I'm not sure if she named Allen Prue on that phone call or if they just said, like, the guy who used to snowplow for me. I'm not sure if she named him to her ex-boyfriend, but if she had never done that, I think it's totally possible to think that Melissa could still be a missing person. And then what would we be talking about? Because then there was her car there and her 2-year-old child in the car. But again, this is in Vermont. This is in the same neck of the woods as Brianna Maitland, who went missing with her car there. Maura Murray went missing not too far with her car there as well. I have to imagine we would be connecting or potentially connecting this case.
Absolutely. I think that is ultimately what broke this case and allowed it to be solved so quickly. But like you said, had she not done those things, we could be sitting here talking about, what we think may have happened, who we think could be involved, and, that they likely wouldn't be some of the initial suspects or, people of interest, because he hadn't even worked for her for a few years. And so even though she had told others she was uncomfortable around him, they probably would be looking at the ex-boyfriend and, people who were closer to her. So ultimately, although it unfortunately couldn't save her life, it made her case rather easy to solve. But I think that's, all it takes in some cases is one piece of evidence, finding on a calendar where that person was going or who they, talked to last on the computer or things like that. And her, putting it out there beforehand was really smart and helped basically solve her own case.
And the fact that the Prues used a burner phone to call Melissa, I'm not sure how they obtained that burner phone. So it's possible that phone call, that incoming call to Melissa's phone, wouldn't have been traced to the Prues. It's possible it could have been, but it's very possible it might not have been as well. Because if it didn't connect through Melissa's phone records, why would they assume it was the Prues?
Right. And that also leads me to believe that the murder was planned as well, because when they called her, they stated who they were. She knew who she was going to help because their car had supposedly broken down. And if they were not planning on her not coming back and they were simply planning on, maybe a sexual assault or something, she would have been able to leave there knowing, who had been involved. And so the fact that they didn't try to use an alias or lure her in some other way leads me to believe that at least they were intending, that kidnapping, but more likely, even so, ultimately the murder was planned beforehand.
And expanding on that thought experiment, like, let's say that they did get away with this and the ex-boyfriend, you said something that jogged my brain about this. The ex-boyfriend shows up because he would still be worried about her because she still has contacted him to tell him what she's doing. And if they had gotten away with this, it would have been the boyfriend showing up at the scene of the crime, essentially, And maybe the investigative part would clear him, but he would always be guilty on some level in the court of public opinion, in other people's eyes, if the Prues got away with this. So no matter what would have happened, if they were not caught for doing this, the ex-boyfriend still, no matter what, would be always looked upon with a negative light. We would do an episode on this and say, well, typically it's a boyfriend, an ex-boyfriend, a husband.
Well, in this case, she called him, right? So there would be some
Yep.
evidence, like that was, so it would be quite a mystery. Like he would either be like really, really looked at as a suspect, or he'd be cleared, because it would have been too obvious if he had done it and then tried to get away with it. Like, because she called him right before she left.
Right. But
So
but we're
it's
going to
one or
have
the
to get
other.
over that in the first place. We're going to have to talk about him, and then whether he's cleared by the investigation or just in the public's eye, he still has to get over that, because it's typically people always look at the husband or ex-boyfriend or anybody close to the victim. So it's just a crazy thought experiment to have, that if they had gotten away with it, they probably wouldn't have been on the radar for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, until he says, she called me to tell me that these people, but that's why they were caught, because they weren't smart enough to really think this thing through.
Yeah. And then they didn't know that Melissa would take the precautions that she did, which, thank goodness she did, even though it unfortunately didn't save her life.
Yeah.
It may have saved other people's lives, though. I mean, do you think
Yes.
this is a couple that would have stopped?
I think had they gotten away with it, they probably would have done it again. So even though she couldn't save her own life, she, I think, likely saved potentially many other lives.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And what is your what does it say to you that she was able to call an ex-boyfriend and have a relationship that was still on amicable terms? So she, trusted him enough to call him and tell him what was happening. So they obviously weren't on bad terms. And I have always been really enamored by the fact that she worked at that restaurant for 18 years. Because when you think about her working at that restaurant when she was 15 and still working there when she's 33, those two things, the ex-boyfriend and just how long she worked at that restaurant, the creamery, what does that say to you about her?
Says she's likely a loyal person, and she has these meaningful relationships. She's going to work at the same place since she was a teenager and continue on there. I'm sure she built many relationships there. And again, if we were sitting here under different circumstances, we may be saying, look at the ex-boyfriend, or it's got to be somebody who has been, at that restaurant watching her and had something to do with that potentially.
And they met online as well. And something about that kind of terrifies me, to be honest, because if there wasn't the internet, and, we can all agree that it's brought good and bad things. But if there wasn't that dating site and no ability to meet, they lived hundreds of miles away. Like, they probably never would have met. Melissa would likely be alive. My question, though, is, do you think they would have killed separately had they never met? Or do you think they would have found a partner to have killed with them at some point, or one of them?
I don't see them as necessarily killing separately. I think had they found a different partner similar to each other, then there's potential there for one or maybe both being involved in murders still. But there's just something with the dynamic between the two of them that I think they kind of fed off of each other a little bit. And I think that it's just the circumstances and their relationship all came together to lead to this.
What do you make of the fact that they admired Melissa. That was in the research, that they had seen her and they had expressed admiration. Did that turn into, well, I guess it did, but when do you think that admiration turned into jealousy, turned into resentment, and then turned into rage?
I think it probably happened early on. I'm not sure that they necessarily truly admired her. I think it was maybe more of an infatuation or something of the sort, that probably, crossed beyond that when he initially had that attraction and asked her out on dates. And then it probably led to jealousy and, potential anger and rage toward Melissa on behalf of Patricia, knowing that, her husband had this attraction, and maybe she had always been the one to choose who would join them in the marriage, and this time perhaps he was the one saying, no, this is who I want to bring in, and maybe she didn't like that. She wanted to maintain that dominance and be the one that he was attracted to and wanted to be with, and nobody else.
Yeah, just feel gross. We have talked about this murder pretty nonstop since you delivered your research, and then we recorded it. And honestly, like, the most tragic part is how they could pull the mother away from the son. Like, they pulled Melissa away from her son and did this in front of him. He was an actual witness. And if the murder itself isn't bad enough, how did they continue to do this with a 2-year-old within sight? How are both people just so blindly consumed with violence and rage that they would continue to do that? And do you think that they ever considered hurting the son?
I don't know. I had found in the research that part of that admiration for Melissa came from the fact that they wanted to start a family of their own. But it's kind of difficult to believe that they wanted to start a family of their own and have their own children, yet they knew that her son, was in the car, and he witnessed enough to be able to tell detectives specifically what happened to her and demonstrate how she was being strangled. So the fact that they didn't seem to care, I don't know. And I'm betting that they probably thought he wasn't old enough, or wasn't paying attention enough to be able to provide any details or anything that happened that he witnessed. But that's another thing, that kind of went in Melissa's favor that day, along with her making that phone call and having that business card, and the son being able to tell detectives exactly what took place.
Yeah, I can't believe it either, that they desperately wanted to start a family, and then they leave a child motherless in a cold car in March. Like, give me a break.
How do you manage to put together these research documents and not have them stay with you, or do they?
They do. I'm human, and even though I find these cases interesting and, want to better understand, or, try to understand at all what some of these horrible people do, they do stay with me, and I think about them and, hope to use the information that I learned from it to help prevent future cases of a similar nature. And, so I kind of just have to separate it out sometimes, so that it doesn't weigh too heavily on me.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you just made to look at something like this and try to apply it to other unsolved cases and try to learn from it. Is there anything specific in this that you can kind of pull out and say this is similar, or this is something that stands out to me to look for next time or look for in other cases?
Well, I mean, I think it goes to show that it's not always those who are closest to the victim, may not be who is initially suspected. And to also, look for that evidence of, where that person was going or what they last did or who they last talked to. And, could be helpful from, a victim risk aspect to, really think about where you're going, who you're meeting with, take somebody with you in addition to letting somebody know where you're going. So I think we can learn things kind of from both sides and hopefully prevent other people from becoming victims, as well as, preventing hopefully some of these crimes from taking place, and could prevent somebody from turning into a serial murderer.